Today's gaming consoles feel like perfect machines. You unbox a PS5 or Xbox Series X, plug it in, and immediately drop into seamless, high-fidelity worlds. But that perfection masks a much messier history. In 1983, Atari quietly drove truckloads of unsold inventory to a New Mexico landfill, burying hundreds of thousands of game cartridges in the dirt. This chart shows the immediate aftermath of that burial. Within 2 years, the US video game market lost 97% of its revenue. Consumers stopped buying, and retailers stopped stocking. The damage was so severe that when Nintendo launched the NES a few years later, they had to brand it as an entertainment system to distance themselves from a word as toxic as video game. Today's hardware stability is built on the ruins of these expensive corporate miscalculations. To understand why today's technology works so reliably, we need to perform an autopsy on the hardware that spectacularly broke. A product's technical capabilities are irrelevant if the audience cannot explain why they need it. At E3 2006, Sony walked on stage and confidently announced the PlayStation 3 would cost up to $599. They were forcing buyers to subsidize a highly complex cell processor and a brand new Blu-ray drive that cost over $200 to include. Players who simply wanted to play the next generation of games felt like they were being asked to pay rent for their console. A few years later, Nintendo proved you don't even need a high price tag to alienate your buyers. They spent millions marketing the Wii U, prioritizing ads for the new touchscreen gamepad over the console itself. The messaging was so tangled that buyers literally thought it was an expensive tablet accessory you plug into the original Wii, rather than an entirely new system. Sales dropped by 87% compared to their previous console. Engineering cannot save a product if the company fails to define what they are actually selling. Hardware cannot exist in a vacuum. It requires the active cooperation of retailers and developers. Sega learned this the hard way in 1995. Trying to undercut Sony, they announced at E3 that their new Saturn console was available immediately, releasing it nearly 4 months early. Because they only had about 30,000 units ready to ship, they excluded massive retail chains from the surprise launch. Companies like KB Toys responded by completely boycotting Sega hardware. Game developers were equally blindsided. Software wasn't ready, leaving the Saturn with a rushed and incredibly thin launch library. You don't build momentum by surprising the industry. You sabotage your own supply chain and break the trust of essential business partners. Visionary hardware eventually collides with the limits of physical infrastructure. In 1999, Sega released the Dreamcast with a built-in 56K modem, treating online multiplayer as a standard, out-of-the-box feature. The problem was that only about 3% of US households actually had broadband internet. Players trying to experience the future were met with constant lag, disconnects, and agonizing load times. 20 years later, Google repeated that exact mistake with Stadia, promising a cloud streaming platform that required no physical console at all. They crashed directly into the physics of internet latency. Players immediately dealt with inconsistent performance and input lag, while also realizing they were paying $60 for games they didn't physically own and could lose if Google pulled the plug. Google shut the service down less than 4 years later. Executing a vision for the future before the real-world infrastructure exists is a billion-dollar mistake. Sometimes the hardware itself is the disaster. Microsoft's Xbox 360 suffered from lead-free solder that cracked under the constant heating and cooling of gaming. This caused a massive failure rate that forced the company to spend $1.15 billion extending warranties. Nintendo's Virtual Boy shipped with a monochrome red LED display that caused actual eye strain, headaches, and nausea, prompting the company to pull it from shelves after roughly 6 months. But a catastrophic product doesn't have to end in total ruin. When the Wii U severely missed its sales targets, Nintendo's internal response stood out. In 2014, President Satoru Iwata took a 50% personal salary cut specifically to avoid laying off employees during the company's financial struggle. He absorbed the hit at the executive level, proving that leadership can take accountability for a hardware disaster, rather than making their workforce pay for the mistake. The consoles dominating the market today are highly refined machines. They exist because the companies building them absorbed the brutal lessons of the Saturn, the Dreamcast, the Wii U, and Stadia. Longevity depends on knowing which marketing gimmicks and half-baked features to leave on the drawing board. But making sure your hardware doesn't die is only half the equation. You still need to know how to optimize the software running on it. Terms like ray tracing and DLSS get thrown around constantly, but most players have no idea what they actually do. Click the video on your screen to learn exactly how these graphical settings work and which ones you can safely ignore.